Not every hero of history wore armor or carried a sword. Some carried buckets, brooms, or cages filled with rats in the early Middle Ages. Life depended on people whose names were rarely written down, workers who performed strange, forgotten jobs that kept entire towns alive. From the man who rang the night bell to the woman who gathered leeches from riverbanks. Each one had a role that may seem unusual today, but was vital then. Their work was harsh, sometimes unpleasant, sometimes dangerous, but without them, the rhythm of daily life would have fallen apart. Tonight, in Boring History for Sleep, we'll wander quietly through cobbled streets and candlelit workshops to discover the strange jobs that existed in the early Middle Ages, from rat catchers and gong farmers to town criers and leech collectors, and learn how their forgotten hands helped build the world we know. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you can return for more calm journeys through the curious corners of history. To understand why so many strange and forgotten jobs once existed in the early Middle Ages, we must first understand the world that needed them. It was a time before machines, before organized systems, before the hum of industry filled the air. Every task that kept society running, from cleaning the streets to lighting the night, from carrying messages to removing waste, depended entirely on human hands. Villages were small, towns were growing, and cities were chaotic webs of smells, sounds, and needs. There were no pipes, no plumbing, no public services as we know them today. The rhythm of life relied on those who did what others could not, or would not do. They were the unspoken machinery of the medieval world, working in the background while the rest of society slept. Most people in the early Middle Ages were tied to the land. Farmers, herders, and laborers made up the vast majority of the population. But even the most self-sufficient village needed specialists. A blacksmith to forge tools, a miller to grind grain, a weaver to make cloth. These were common trades, well-respected and essential. Yet, beyond them, there existed another layer of work, jobs that were necessary but strange, useful but often undesirable. These were the jobs born from gaps in the system, from the simple fact that life creates waste, chaos, and need. Every city produced refuse, every market left behind scraps, every household needed cleaning, every river delivered both water and filth. And so, the people who stepped forward to handle these things became the silent custodians of daily existence. That a world without machines, the early medieval world had no engines, no running water, no centralized heating. Everything required human effort. If a candle needed lighting in the street, someone had to light it. If a bell needed ringing to mark the hour, someone had to pull the rope. If a well became clogged, someone had to climb down into the darkness to clear it. Where a modern town relies on wires, motors, and pipes, the medieval town relied on people, each one performing a specific, often peculiar task. And though their work might seem odd to us now, it was as vital as the farmer's harvest or the blacksmith's forge that in that world, specialization was survival. Every craft existed because someone, somewhere, had learned to do what others could not endure. The tanner who scraped hides by hand, the gong farmer who cleaned cesspits by night, the rat catcher who faced the disease carrying vermin that scurried beneath floors. All of them filled a void no one else wished to fill. The value of the unpleasant in our modern view of history. We often imagine knights, scholars, and merchants, people of prestige or power. But the truth is that most of medieval life depended on the invisible class of workers who performed its dirtiest, most uncomfortable jobs. They were not honored, yet they were indispensable. Their value came not from wealth or respect, but from necessity. The streets of a growing town, filled with animals and waste, needed cleaning before disease could spread. Wells had to be kept pure. Markets needed to be cleared of spoiled food. None of this was glamorous work, but it kept people alive. And so, while nobles discussed politics in their halls and merchants counted their coins in busy markets. These humble workers toiled quietly in the background, unseen, unheard, but essential. Their days were marked not by comfort, but by endurance. Their tools were simple, their rewards modest, but in their hands rested the fragile balance of hygiene, safety, and order. The shadow workers, many of these jobs were done in darkness, not only literal night, but the darkness of social standing. The night watchman, for instance, patrolled the streets while others slept, listening for the sound of danger or fire. He carried a lantern and a staff, calling out the hours in the cold, the gong farmer. Among the most infamous of all medieval workers, entered the cesspits that lay beneath towns and castles, great holes filled with waste, dug deep beneath the wooden floors. By torchlight, he cleaned them with long-handled shovels, often at great personal risk. Yet his work prevented illness and kept the air above breathable. He worked in silence, for few wished to be reminded of his presence. Then there was the rat catcher, another creature of the shadows. His task was dangerous, for rats carried not only filth, but plague. Armed with traps, dogs, and patience, he hunted them through barns, cellars, and sewers. People avoided him, fearing the creatures he handled, yet when the rats returned, they sought him out again. These men and women formed the unseen skeleton of society. Their work was not praised, yet without them, the medieval world would have drowned in its own chaos. The curious and the creative, not all strange jobs were grim. Some were born of creativity, of the need to entertain, communicate, or organize. Town criers, for instance, served as living news outlets. In a world where few could read, they walked the streets ringing bells, shouting announcements of births, deaths, decrees, and events. Their voices were the pulse of the town. The cry of "Hear ye," was not performance, it was public service. There were also ale conners, men whose duty was to taste and test the quality of ale sold in taverns. They knelt on wooden benches soaked in spilled drink to judge its purity. Not the most dignified work, but one that mattered deeply to thirsty townsfolk. In markets, weighers and inspectors kept trade honest. They checked scales, examined goods, and punished those who cheated. Gong beaters drove animals through streets, clearing paths for nobles or wagons. Watchmen of bridges guarded crossings against thieves. Every task, no matter how small, found a name, a worker, and a rhythm. The chain of need. The structure of medieval life was like a chain, every link dependent on the next. The farmer grew grain, the miller ground it, the baker made bread, the taster ensured it was safe, the street sweeper cleared the crumbs. Each role existed because of another, and together they formed a web of purpose. Even the most bizarre jobs fit perfectly into that pattern. A leech collector might spend hours standing knee-deep in swamps, letting the blood-sucking creatures attach to her legs before scraping them off into jars. Doctors needed leeches for bloodletting, a common medical practice, so her strange work sustained the healers that a sin-eater might be called upon at funerals, eating bread and drinking ale left beside a corpse, symbolically taking on the deceased's sins so their soul could rest. Though considered eerie, this role gave comfort to grieving families. And though some of these jobs were born of superstition rather than science, they reveal something remarkable about humanity, our endless ability to create meaning, to give purpose even to the most unusual acts. Work as identity in the early Middle Ages. One's job was not just a way to earn a living. It was an identity. Most people inherited their trade from parents or relatives. Skills were passed down like heirlooms, from father to son, mother to daughter. That a blacksmith's child learned the forge before they could read. A shepherd's son knew the hills better than the roads. A rat catcher's apprentice learned the smell of places where vermin hid. There were no resumes, no interviews, only the weight of experience and the trust of familiarity. The TO work was to belong. To belong was to survive. Even the strangest jobs held honor in that simple truth. The humble architects of survival looking back. It's easy to smile at the oddness of these occupations. The leech collector, the candle maker, the gong farmer, the town crier. But to the people who lived them, they were lifelines. Every task, no matter how small or strange, played its part in the greater system. The medieval world was fragile. One bad harvest, one outbreak, one flood could destroy everything. The strange jobs kept that fragility from breaking. They were the invisible scaffolding beneath a society that barely held together, yet somehow endured. These workers rarely appear in chronicles or royal decrees. No one painted their portraits or wrote songs about them. But in their steady labor, we find the real heartbeat of history. The quiet persistence that allowed kingdoms to rise and fall while the streets below remained swept. The lamps stayed lit, and the fields stayed fertile. They remind us that civilization is not built by grand gestures, but by the accumulation of small, often unseen acts of care. And so, when we speak of the strange jobs of the early Middle Ages, we are not laughing at their oddity. We are honoring their necessity and the people who performed them, day after day, without praise, yet with purpose, because in the end, history is not just the story of kings and wars, but of those who cleaned the halls, lit the fires, and kept the world quietly turning. In the early Middle Ages, long before the hum of modern sanitation and the quiet efficiency of city maintenance, there walked a man whose job existed in the shadows. He had no uniform, no badge of honor, and no promise of comfort. Yet without him, entire towns would have fallen into ruin. He was the rat catcher, the silent guardian of the streets. To live in a medieval town was to live among noise, scent, and survival. The streets were narrow and uneven, the air heavy with smoke from 1,000 hearths. Beneath the chatter of merchants and the clatter of hooves lay another sound, a constant, restless scratching, the faint squeal of creatures that thrived in the dark. Rats lived everywhere, in the granaries, in the walls, beneath the bridges, even in the shadows of the churches. They came with ships, wagons, and travelers. They feasted on grain, waste, and whatever the people left behind. They carried fleas, and the fleas carried death. Yet in an age that did not yet know of germs or contagion, few understood their true danger. The people only knew one thing, that rats brought sickness and ruin wherever they went. And so, amid the life of every growing town, there was always one man whose duty it was to hunt them. He was not celebrated, yet he was needed more than he was ever thanked. The rat catcher's day began when the rest of the town was ending. As doors were bolted and lamps blown out, he prepared for work. He carried with him a lantern of dim, oily light, a bundle of handmade traps, a small knife or club, and often a dog trained for the chase. His clothes were thick, patched, and stained from years of toil. His boots were caked in mud, and his face bore the marks of long nights spent in alleys and cellars that he walked quietly, listening more than he looked. He knew the rhythm of the rats, how they crept along the walls, how they followed the scent of food, how they hid when they sensed light. His traps were simple but clever, built of wood and wire, designed to snap shut or hold the creatures alive. Some rat catchers preferred to kill them outright. Others sold them alive to apothecaries or animal trainers. Nothing in the medieval world went to waste, not even vermin. The rat catcher's work was dangerous. He climbed into the same dark spaces that the creatures inhabited, under floorboards, behind storage rooms, into the sewers that ran beneath the town. He knew the smell of rot and damp better than most men knew the scent of fresh bread. He breathed the air that others avoided, thick with decay and stagnant water. Sometimes he worked alone, sometimes with his dog, the two moving like shadows through the half-light. The dog's ears would twitch, its nose pressed to the ground. And when the rustle came, both man and animal moved as one. He lived on the edge of society, both literally and figuratively. His cottage stood near the outskirts of town, close to the refuse pits and away from the finer homes. People needed him, but they did not wish to see him. He carried the odor of his trade, a mix of straw, iron, and the faint sourness of the places he had been. Children watched him from a distance, whispering stories that painted him as half man, half phantom. Yet when the scratching in the walls became too loud, when a merchant found his grain spoiled or a baker saw droppings near his flour, they sent for him. He arrived silently, worked efficiently, and left with few words. His payment was modest. Sometimes he received a few coins, sometimes a meal, sometimes a bed for the night. He rarely asked for more. Pride was not his reward, survival was. But there was a strange respect in his craft, even if people refused to admit it. He knew the hidden anatomy of the town better than any official or noble. He saw the places that no one else dared enter, the cellars, the drains, the silent corners where the living and the dying crossed paths that in times of plague. His work became both feared and sought after. He was among the first to see the signs, dead rats in the streets, the sudden quiet of places once teeming with life. He did not know the word infection, but he knew that when the rats died, people soon followed. He walked through towns, haunted by fever, where even the air seemed heavy with despair. Some avoided him out of superstition, believing that he carried the sickness himself, while others begged him to rid their homes of the creatures that brought death. The nights were his constant companion. While others slept, he wandered through the maze of streets, his lantern swinging softly. The glow of its flame caught on puddles and glistened against the stones. The world at that hour was smaller, quieter, but alive in its own strange way. The distant hoot of an owl, the drip of rain from a roof, the creak of a sign in the wind. He walked steadily, each sound a clue, each shadow a possibility. Sometimes the town was utterly still. The only movement came from beneath the ground, the quick scuttle of feet, the faint rustle of straw. Then the trap snapped shut, and another small battle in the endless war between man and vermin was won. Yet he knew that victory never lasted. For every nest he destroyed, another appeared. The rats multiplied faster than he could catch them, their survival as tireless as his pursuit. There was no glory in his labor, but there was purpose. He saw himself as a necessary part of the world's balance. Not a hero, not a savior, just a man doing what must be done. Civilization, he understood, was fragile. The walls might be strong, the markets busy, the churches grand, but beneath it all, the rats waited. If he faltered, the balance tipped. So he did not falter. When dawn approached, the streets slowly returned to life. Bakers lit their ovens, merchants opened their shutters, and smoke began to rise from chimneys. The rat catcher, his work finished for the night, walked home through the waking town. His shoulders ached, his boots were wet, his lantern burned low. He nodded to a few faces that dared meet his gaze, though most turned away. He passed unnoticed, and perhaps he preferred it that way to his cottage. He emptied his traps, cleaned his tools, and washed what he could in a basin of cold water. The dog curled up beside the door, tail twitching in dreams of the hunt. The man ate a crust of bread, perhaps a piece of salted fish, and sat in silence. Outside, the morning sun touched the rooftops, painting the world in gold. Inside, the rat catcher closed his eyes, drifting into sleep as the rest of the village began its day. His life was not one of comfort, but it was one of certainty. He understood that work was not about pride, but about purpose. While others sought wealth, he sought quiet, a kind of peace that came only from knowing the town above would rest a little easier because of his labor. He asked for no reward, no recognition, because he knew that the best work in the world often goes unseen. Even centuries later, his presence lingers in the imagination. That solitary figure with a lantern, walking through misty alleys, listening for the faintest movement in the dark. He is a symbol of endurance, of humanity's constant effort to push back against decay. His world was one of shadows, but in those shadows, he found meaning. The rat catcher of the early Middle Ages was more than a man who trapped vermin. He was the keeper of an invisible order, the guardian of health before anyone understood what health truly meant. His story is not written in books, but it is etched in the survival of towns that might otherwise have been lost. He lived without applause, worked without witnesses, and vanished without legacy. Yet his quiet duty helped hold together the fragile web of medieval life. And though the world has changed beyond recognition, the spirit of his work endures. Every city, every home, every system that runs smoothly owes something to those unseen hands, to the ones who do their work while the rest of the world sleeps. The rat catcher's lantern may have long gone dark, but the light of his labor, steady, humble, and necessary, still burns in the silence of all that remains clean, calm, and safe. There are jobs that history forgets not because they were unimportant, but because no one wanted to remember them. In the early Middle Ages, when cities were small and sanitation was little more than an idea, there was one such job that defined both necessity and discomfort. It belonged to the gong farmer, the man whose work began only when the sun went down and whose labor kept entire towns from sinking beneath their own. To speak of him is to speak of the unseen side of medieval life, the side that did not glitter with the gold of knights or echo with the songs of minstrels, but the side that existed beneath the floorboards and behind the walls. It was the side that smelled of reality, the simple, undeniable evidence that wherever there are people, there must be someone to clean what people leave behind. The gong farmer was that someone. His title, strange to modern ears, came from the old word gong, meaning waste or filth. His world was a network of pits and cesspools that lay beneath the wooden floors of homes, taverns, and castles. Every building that housed people also produced what had to be taken away, and since there were no pipes, no underground systems, and no running water, the task fell to men who worked by night, unseen, uncelebrated it, and yet essential to survival. His work began after dark, when the rest of the town was quiet, when taverns closed and candles burned low in windows. The gong farmer walked the empty streets with his cart and his tools. He carried long-handled shovels, buckets, ropes, and thick gloves of rough leather. Sometimes he wore cloth over his face to dull the smell, though it hardly helped. He moved quietly, his footsteps muffled by the damp ground. Few people saw him, but many knew when he had passed, for the air itself seemed to remember to be a gong farmer was to know the underbelly of every place one lived. He entered through back doors, trapdoors, and narrow passages that led beneath buildings. There, in the flickering light of his lantern, he descended into the dark pits where waste had collected for months, sometimes years. The air was thick and heavy. The walls of the pits were lined with wood, slick with moisture, and the floor beneath his boots was soft and uncertain. He worked slowly, filling buckets one by one, passing them up to his helper who emptied them into the cart above. The work was backbreaking, the smell unbearable, and the danger constant. The pits were unpredictable. The wood could collapse, the air could turn foul, and in moments, the worker could lose consciousness from the gases below. There were no safety measures, no tools of science to guide them. Only instinct, endurance, and the understanding that the job had to be done. Because if it wasn't, disease would spread, and the people above, those who never thought of what lay beneath, would pay the price. The gong farmer's shifts lasted through the night. When dawn approached, he would leave quietly, pushing his cart toward the edge of town. The waste was taken far beyond the walls, to the fields or to pits dug specifically for disposal. In some places, it was buried deep. In others, it was left to dry and later used as fertilizer, a grim but practical truth of medieval agriculture. Nothing, not even filth, was without purpose that he returned home as the world was waking. People opened their shutters, unaware that the man passing them in silence had just spent hours working in the shadows for their comfort. His hands were raw, his clothes soaked through, his body exhausted. He washed as best he could, though the smell clung to him like a shadow that would never leave. For many, the scent was a mark of shame. For him, it was a sign of labor. The gong farmer lived apart from others, not by choice but by the quiet rules of society. Few wanted to share his company. He was treated with politeness in daylight, but rarely with friendship. Children were told not to follow him, and innkeepers hesitated to offer him a room. Yet every town needed him, and those who understood the truth of his work gave him a certain unspoken respect. The irony of his existence was that his work was despised and yet absolutely vital. Civilization depended on those willing to step into the filth others refused to acknowledge. Many gong farmers passed their trade from father to son, not out of pride, but necessity. It was steady work, paid in coin when few other jobs were. Some were even employed by city councils or castle stewards, given fixed routes to maintain. The pay was better than that of many field laborers, though no amount of coin could buy the comfort of social acceptance. They were tolerated but never embraced. Their nights were filled with the same sounds: the scrape of shovels, the slosh of buckets, the quiet murmur between workers, the distant bark of dogs in the streets above. Sometimes they joked to make the hours shorter. Sometimes they sang softly to drown out the echo of their own movements. The work was lonely but shared, and among those who did it, there was a strange camaraderie, a bond born not of joy, but of endurance. Despite the hardship, there was a kind of dignity in what they did. They were caretakers of cleanliness, even if their world was filth. They knew that while others celebrated festivals and feasts, while bells rang and markets thrived, their unseen labor kept the air breathable and the water safe. Without them, the streets would have reeked of decay, and disease would have risen unchecked. Their contribution was invisible, but it was everywhere. There are records, scattered and rare, that mention them. Some towns kept logs of payments made to gong men or night cleaners. Their wages were modest but regular, a small comfort in a world where hunger and uncertainty ruled. Occasionally, a note of tragedy appears: a worker lost to the fumes below, or a pit collapse that buried a team alive. These incidents were recorded briefly, with little ceremony, yet behind each one lay a story of quiet bravery. They were men who descended each night into the places everyone else avoided, knowing that one mistake could mean the end. If you imagine one of them walking home after such a night, you can almost see it: the pale light of dawn, the damp air of early morning, the sound of his boots on stone, his shoulders slumped beneath the weight of fatigue, his breath forming clouds in the chill air. A few people pass him without speaking. Somewhere, a baker lights his oven. A bell tolls the first hour of the new day. The gong farmer keeps walking, silent, unseen, fading back into the rhythm of the world that will never know his name. Centuries later, the traces of their labor still lie beneath old cities, layers of compacted soil, filled with the remnants of 1,000 forgotten cleanings. Archaeologists find their work in the form of waste pits sealed under new foundations, the ghostly outlines of wooden walls, the fragments of tools left behind. Even in decay, their work preserved history. Through what they removed, we learn what medieval people ate, how they lived, what they discarded. Ironically, the most unpleasant job in the world became one of the greatest gifts to the study of the past. The gong farmer's existence teaches something simple and profound: that civilization is not built only by those who design, rule, or create, but by those who maintain, by those who face what others prefer to forget. His nights were filled with darkness, yet from that darkness came cleanliness, order, and health. He was, in his way, the quiet balance to the noise and chaos above. When we think of the Middle Ages, we imagine grand castles, markets full of color, knights in shining armor. But beneath all that, hidden under floors and cobblestones, was the unseen world of men like him, the world that made the visible one possible. He worked not for praise, not for recognition, but because someone had to. And when dawn returned and the city woke to its ordinary routines, it did so on clean ground, safe because of hands that had worked unseen through the night. In that simple, often miserable duty lay a kind of heroism. The gong farmer's life was short, hard, and humble, but his purpose was eternal. Every modern system of sanitation, every pipe that carries waste unseen beneath our feet, is an echo of what he once did with a shovel and a lantern. He stood at the edge of humanity's endurance and proved that even the lowest labor, when done with care, sustains the highest forms of civilization. He may be gone now, his name forgotten, his trade replaced by machines and pipes, but his spirit lingers in the silent infrastructure that keeps our cities alive. For as long as people live together, someone will always bear the quiet duty of keeping their world clean. And though the gong farmer's lantern no longer glows in the midnight streets, its light, humble, steady, unseen, still burns wherever order rises from chaos. In a world before newspapers, before printed words or glowing screens, there was a voice that carried through the narrow streets and market squares, a human bell that announced the rhythm of each day. It belonged to the town crier, a man whose duty was not to fight wars or plow fields, but to speak, to inform, and to connect. He was the sound of the Middle Ages itself, clear, steady, and trusted above all others. At dawn, when the mist still hung over the rooftops and the first fires were being lit in the hearths, the town crier would walk into the open square with his bell in hand. He wore a cloak to protect him from the morning chill, a leather belt heavy with scrolls, and boots worn from endless walking. His face was known to all, though few knew much about him. He was not rich, not powerful, not even particularly free in what he said. Yet every word that left his lips held weight, for when the crier spoke, he spoke for the realm itself. The bell came first, a sharp, ringing sound that cut through sleep, that made shutters open and footsteps gather. The clang echoed off stone and timber, waking the town to attention. And then, when the noise faded, his voice followed, strong, trained, and deliberate. Hear ye, he would call, the ancient phrase that summoned all who wished to know the world beyond their own door. That he read from the scrolls that hung at his side, decrees from the local lord, orders from the crown, notices of new taxes, lost property, or public meetings. His job was to be both messenger and memory. In a time when most people could not read, his words were the only link between the written world of power and the spoken world of the people. He brought law into life, turning paper into sound, sound into action. People gathered as he spoke. Merchants paused in setting up their stalls. Housewives leaned from windows, their hands still dusted with flour. Children sat on steps, listening though they barely understood. Even the old men who had heard it all before stood quietly, heads bowed slightly, as if the air itself demanded stillness. The crier's words were not always welcome. Sometimes he brought news of higher taxes, of punishment, or of war, but they were always believed. When his announcements were done, he would post the parchment to a wall or door, the ink glistening faintly in the weak light. It was rare that anyone stopped to read it, but the gesture mattered. The written notice gave form to what the town had heard, proof that the voice had truth behind it. Then he would move on, ringing his bell again, his voice rising and falling like the toll of time itself. The town crier's work did not end with law or decree. He was also the keeper of smaller news, the gossip, the lost items, the public calls for help. He might announce the finding of a runaway animal, the arrival of a merchant ship, or the search for a missing child. He was the thread that tied the whole community together, carrying words from one end of the town to the other. Through him, A place learned what it was, who was gone, who had returned. What the day would bring. It was not an easy life. The crier walked in all weather, rain, snow, and wind. He shouted until his voice cracked and his throat burned. Some days he stood in empty streets, his words carried away by storms, heard by no one. On others, he spoke before crowds restless with anger or fear, their faces pale with the weight of bad news. He had to remain calm, clear, and firm. The voice of the town could not tremble. He was paid modestly by the local authority, his wage steady but small. Yet the job carried a kind of dignity that few others had. To be the crier was to be trusted. With secrets, with laws, with the delicate balance between order and chaos. His loyalty was tested often. He spoke for those in power, but he lived among those without it. He knew both sides, and he walked the narrow space between them with care. When he finished his rounds, the town would feel his absence. The silence that followed seemed deeper for it. His voice was the heartbeat of the streets. Without it, something essential was missing. Even the sound of his bell fading into distance carried a comfort, the assurance that someone was keeping watch, someone was holding the threads of communication together. At times, he served not only as messenger, but as witness. When punishments were carried out in the square, he was there, reading aloud the crimes and the sentences. His voice framed justice, giving the law a face it otherwise lacked. In markets, he settled disputes by reading official prices or weights. During emergencies, fires, floods, or disease, he was the first to warn the people. In an age without telegraphs or messengers on horseback for every street, his presence was a living signal. But there was another side to his work, a quieter, lonelier one. When the crowd dispersed, when no ears remained to listen, the crier walked alone through the same streets, his bell silent at his side. He saw the town in all its moods, the laughter of festivals, the grief of funerals, the ordinary hum of midday, the hush of snow falling at night. He was both inside and outside of the life he served. His own voice belonged to others. His own thoughts, rarely spoken, he carried memories like scrolls, rolled and stored in the chambers of his mind. He knew who had lived and died, which families had prospered, which had fallen into ruin. He knew when a law was just and when it was cruel, though it was not his place to say so. The crier's strength was discipline, to speak, but never to comment, to inform, but never to judge. His was a profession of precision and of silence once the words were done. Some criers grew old in their post, their voices changing with the years, roughening with age, but deepening with experience. They became part of the landscape, as familiar as the church bells or the market cross. When one died, the town often felt it more than it expected, as if a certain rhythm of life had vanished. The next man to take up the bell might speak the same words, but never quite in the same way. A voice, after all, is personal. It carries not only sound, but soul. For the people of the early Middle Ages, the town crier represented something simple yet powerful: trust. His words reached everyone, rich and poor alike. They reminded the people that even in times of uncertainty, there was still order, still connection. The streets might be muddy, the houses cold, but the sound of the crier's bell was the sound of a community still holding together. Centuries later, when the first newspapers appeared, when printing presses began to hum and literacy spread, the crier's voice slowly faded. The bell grew quiet. The scrolls gave way to paper sheets nailed to doors, and the crowds that once gathered in the square now gathered around written words. But even as his role disappeared, the memory of him endured. The man with the bell and the strong, clear voice who once carried the world from one street to another in many towns, his echo still lingers. There are records of his proclamations, written after the fact by clerks who heard them firsthand. Some towns still hold small reenactments, where a figure in bright livery rings a bell and calls out news for festivals. The words are no longer law, but they stir something ancient in the air, a reminder of a time when truth traveled not by ink, but by breath. If you were to walk through an old medieval town today, when the streets are empty and the air hangs still, you might almost hear it, the faint ring of a bell, the cadence of a voice announcing something half forgotten. The wind carries sound, well through narrow alleys, and sometimes it feels as if those echoes are still alive, whispering the shape of time. The town crier has long since vanished, but his role remains in every messenger, every broadcaster, every voice that speaks to a crowd. He was the first communicator of the common world, the bridge between power and people, the voice that turned silence into understanding. He did not write history, but he spoke it, aloud, clearly, and with the kind of sincerity that only those who live among the people can possess. And though the ink has replaced the voice, and the bell has given way to signal and sound, the essence remains unchanged. Every piece of news still needs a voice to give it life. Every society, no matter how advanced, still needs someone to stand before the crowd and say, "Hear ye, this is what we share." The town crier, long gone, still lives in that act. His voice, carried across centuries, reminds us that history is not only what was written down, but what was spoken into the air, heard by many, and remembered by a few. In the hush of evening, as you drift toward sleep, you can almost hear him. Again, the bell ringing softly, the words rolling gently through the mist, calling not just to a crowd, but to time itself. When the sun slipped behind the rooftops of a medieval town, and the last of the market cries faded into silence, another life began. The daytime world of trade and chatter gave way to shadows, to the creak of wooden signs in the wind, to the soft whisper of river water flowing under the bridge. Most people closed their shutters and barred their doors, retreating into the glow of the hearth. But for one man, the coming of night was not a time for rest. It was the beginning of his long, solitary shift. The night watchman, he was the sleepless guardian of the streets, the quiet keeper of peace when the rest of the town slept. His task was simple in words, but immense in weight: to stay awake while others dreamed. In an age before police, before streetlights, before any true sense of order after dark, his presence was all that stood between safety and chaos. When darkness settled, he took his lantern and his staff and began his rounds. The light from his lamp flickered across the cobblestones, carving small pools of gold into the deep blue of the night. His boots echoed softly through the alleys. The rhythm of his steps was the only sound that reminded the town it was still being watched. Still guarded, he knew every sound. The bark of a distant dog, the flap of a loose shutter, the drip of water from a roof. Each carried meaning. A door creaking might be the wind, or it might be a thief. A shadow moving could be a rat, or something worse. His eyes were trained to read the night like a book, each page written in faint light and movement. He walked slowly, listening, humming sometimes under his breath to keep the silence from pressing too heavily. His staff, thick and strong, served both as weapon and warning. Tapping it on the stones at intervals, he sent out a steady rhythm, the heart of the sleeping town. It told anyone awake that he was near. To the honest, that sound was comfort. To the dishonest, it was a warning. The night watchman's duty was not only to keep thieves at bay, but to protect against fire. In towns built mostly of wood and thatch, fire was the most feared enemy of all. A single spark could devour an entire street before dawn. And so, as he passed each home, he glanced up at the rooftops, sniffed the air for smoke, watched the glow of every chimney. If he saw light where none should be, he called out, loud and sharp, "Take care of your fire." His voice, rough from years of shouting into the cold, carried through the stillness, reminding every house that someone was awake. Someone was watching. He often stopped at the town gates, where guards kept their own lonely vigil. They shared a few words, traded a sip of water or a small piece of bread. Then he moved on, walking the narrow lanes where no sound but his own footsteps lingered. In some towns, he would call out the hours, midnight and all's well, marking time for those who could not see it. The sound drifted through the dark, echoing off stone, blending with the faint hum of the river or the cry of a night bird. There was a certain peace to it, a slow rhythm that few others ever knew. The world seemed smaller at night, simpler. The clutter of the day was gone, replaced by stillness and the quiet breathing of the town. From behind shuttered windows came the muffled sounds of life. A baby's cry, the murmur of late conversation, the steady creak of a rocking chair. The watchman passed them all, unseen but present, the invisible thread that connected them. Sometimes the night was not peaceful. There were fights in taverns, drunken men stumbling home from late hours of celebration, travelers lost and frightened by the darkness. The watchman dealt with them as best he could, calm, firm, patient. He was not a soldier, but he had authority, earned by reputation rather than rank. The people knew his face, and more importantly, his voice. It was a voice that could be gentle when it needed to soothe, and commanding when danger arose. There were nights of storm, when the wind howled through the alleys and rain lashed against the shutters. Those were the hardest. The lantern sputtered in the wet air, the flame threatening to die. His cloak grew heavy with water, his fingers numb. Still, he walked, because stopping meant sleep, and sleep meant failure. The duty of the watchman allowed no rest until the dawn bell rang that he often worked alone, though in larger towns there might be several of them, each assigned to a district. They crossed paths in the early hours, exchanging brief greetings, the kind born from shared endurance. There was no need for many words, a nod, a quiet joke, a shared understanding that they were the only souls awake in a slumbering world. Then each went back into the dark, their lanterns drifting apart like small ships on a black sea. The night could be kind or cruel. In the stillness of a clear evening, the stars stretched endlessly above him, and the moon lit the rooftops with silver light. In those moments, the watchman felt not alone but connected to the town, to the sky, to the silent pulse of life that continued beneath every door. He might pause for a moment, leaning on his staff, his breath rising like mist, and simply listen. There was beauty in that silence, in the steady rhythm of existence. But on other nights, the dark seemed endless. The cold bit into his bones, and time itself slowed. Every shadow felt deeper, every corner uncertain. He fought not only against danger, but against fatigue, the temptation to sit, to rest, to close his eyes even for a moment. The world around him was a test of will. He whispered to himself to stay awake, to keep moving. His mind replayed memories, faces from the day, voices of friends, the sound of morning bells. Those thoughts kept him alive in the long hours before dawn. The town watchman was often an older man, someone who had worked the fields or fought in past wars. Someone whose body no longer had the strength for heavy labor, but whose spirit refused to rest. He was dependable, steady, a man whose presence alone brought calm. He might have been poor, but he held a certain quiet pride. After all, who else could claim to know the town as he did? Every street, every corner, every sound belonged to his memory. He was there when thieves fled through the shadows. He was there when the first cries of a newborn echoed through a window. He was there when a storm broke loose at midnight, when roofs trembled, when people whispered prayers for safety. The night had 1,000 stories, and he was part of them all. When at last the sky began to pale, the watchman felt the weight of his sleeplessness ease. The stars faded, replaced by a soft gray light that spilled slowly over the town. Smoke began to rise from chimneys again. Doors creaked open. The baker stirred his ovens. The blacksmith stretched beside his forge, and the first voices of morning returned. The watchman's work was done. He made his final round, checking that no harm had come in the dark. Then he walked toward the town square, where the bell would soon ring to mark the start of the day. As he passed, people nodded to him, some with thanks, some with indifference. A few greeted him warmly, offering a cup of water or a piece of bread. Most simply carried on with their routines, unaware of how much they owed to his long night. That was the way of things. His reward was not praise, but the calm certainty that he had done his duty. Once moored, he returned home just as the first rays of sunlight touched the rooftops. His cloak steamed faintly as it dried in the warmth. Inside his small room, the lantern still burned, its flame weak but steady. He set down his staff, stretched his weary limbs, and let the silence of the morning take him. The town outside was alive again, safe and bright, unaware of the quiet labor that had guarded it through the dark. Before he slept, he sometimes looked out the window one last time. The streets he had walked all night were now filled with people. Children running, carts rattling, merchants calling out prices. It was as if the world had been reborn. He smiled faintly, knowing that by the time they all rested again, he would be awake once more, the cycle continuing as it always had. The night watchman's legacy is not written in history books or carved in stone. It exists in the idea of security itself, in the trust that we can sleep because someone else is awake. His life was a bridge between danger and peace, between night and day. He belonged to the hours when most of the world forgot itself. And in that forgotten time, he held everything together, even now, when streetlights burn bright and walls of brick stand firm. There is something comforting in the thought of him, that lone figure moving through darkness with a lantern in hand, eyes open, heart steady, steps sure. He was not a hero in the grand sense, but he was the guardian of ordinary lives, the patient watcher who made the quiet possible. And when you think of the medieval town asleep beneath the stars, the dogs curled in corners, the fires burning low, the wind whispering through the alleys, imagine him there, still walking. The sound of his staff against the stones echoes faintly in the distance, a reminder that peace, even in the darkest hours, is never truly alone. There were many strange professions in the early Middle Ages, but few carried the quiet combination of mystery, endurance, and necessity like the leech collector. She, or sometimes he, lived on the very edges of the known world, near rivers, marshes, and still ponds, where the water thickened with mud and life thrived unseen beneath the surface. Her task was as simple as it was strange: to collect leeches for medicine, though small, slippery creatures that medieval healers believed could balance the body and restore health. The world she lived in was far from the noise of towns and the clang of workshops. Her mornings began not with the sound of bells or chatter, but with mist. Thick, cool mist that rose from the water like breath, wrapping the world in gray. She walked barefoot through the reeds, her skirts heavy with dew, her basket slung low on her arm. The air smelled of wet earth and slow decay, not unpleasant, but deep, ancient, like the very lungs of the land exhaling. She knew every curve of the stream, every patch where leeches clung thickest. She could read the ripples of the water like a map, sense movement beneath the surface, feel the pull of life on her skin. The work required patience and stillness. The leeches did not come to those who splashed or hurried. They came to warmth, to quiet. And so she stood, motionless, her feet sinking into the cool mud, her breath slow, her thoughts emptied. It first, the water was silent. Then, after minutes that felt like hours, there came a faint tickle, the first leech finding her skin. Another followed, then another. Their touch was cold, almost delicate, but soon there were dozens, each attaching, each drinking in silence. She did not flinch. She waited. Only when her legs were covered in the small, dark shapes did she begin to move. She waded back to the bank, careful not to disturb them. There, with calm precision, she plucked them one by one, dropping them into the clay pot she carried. Inside, the leeches writhed slowly, twisting over one another in dark, glistening spirals. Each one was a living tool, destined for the hands of a physician or barber surgeon in town, who would use them to draw blood from those believed to be ill. For this, she was paid in coins or food, sometimes only in promise. It was hard, humble work, but it was work that mattered. In an age when medicine was more faith than science, leeches were believed to carry the power to cleanse. They were called upon for fevers, headaches, and even melancholy. The leech collector supplied the hope behind the cure. Her life was shaped by solitude. Few chose her company. The work was too strange, too uncomfortable for others to imagine. Children whispered that she was half witch, that she spoke to the water and it obeyed her. She ignored them. She had no time for stories. The marsh was her companion, the water her livelihood. It was a world that most avoided, but one she understood deeply. When she returned home, her clothes were soaked, her hands pale and wrinkled from hours in the water. She lit her small fire and sat near it, letting the warmth return to her limbs. The pot of leeches she kept in a cool, dark place, sometimes near the door, sometimes buried halfway in the ground to keep them alive longer. She sprinkled bits of damp moss on top and covered the mouth with a cloth to keep them from escaping that night. The marsh called to her still. The frogs croaked in the dark, the reeds rustled with unseen creatures, and the soft lap of water against the shore was like breathing. She listened to it the way others might listen to music. The world she knew was not silent. It was simply softer, older. Leech collectors existed in every corner of the medieval world, though few recorded their names. They were mostly women, often widows or those too poor for other trades. Some worked for apothecaries, others for monasteries where healers prepared their remedies. A few sold directly to traveling surgeons, who carried their leeches in small jars along with knives and bandages. It was not glamorous work, but it sustained both the collector and the healer. One drew life from the water, the other from the blood. The risks were many. The marshes were treacherous, their mud deep and deceptive. A single misstep could mean being trapped, sinking slowly into the cold. The leeches themselves carried danger. Infection followed the bites, and loss of blood could weaken even the strongest. Yet she continued, day after day, because to stop was to starve. Sometimes she sang while she worked, low and tuneless. A sound meant more for herself than for the world. The echo carried across the water, mingling with the calls of birds. In those moments, the line between her and the land seemed to fade. She was part of it, a living piece of the same slow, breathing landscape. The townspeople rarely thought of her except when they needed her. They came to her door with their requests. The surgeon needs more. The healer's jar is empty. Can you bring them by next week? She nodded, asked for fair payment, and went back to her work. She did not ask what the leeches would be used for, but she knew. She had seen them at work, small bodies pressed against pale skin, swelling with dark blood while the healer murmured words of reassurance. When the leeches dropped away, sated and heavy, they were sometimes returned to her, to be fed again in the marsh. And the cycle continued. There was something strangely poetic in that circle, blood drawn from the sick to feed the living creatures. The creatures returning to the marsh to feed the next. The collector was the unseen bridge between those worlds, her work unnoticed but essential in the cold months. When the ponds froze and the marsh turned silent, her task grew harder. She broke the ice with sticks and stones, dipping her hands into water so cold it burned. The leeches moved sluggishly then, harder to find, harder to catch. Still, she did not stop. Hunger pressed more fiercely than cold. She learned to keep the leeches alive through winter, storing them near the fire, feeding them bits of blood-soaked cloth. The creatures became as familiar to her as animals or tools. She spoke to them sometimes, softly, as one speaks to things that share one's solitude. Though her work was humble, it tied her to a long tradition of healing. Long before physicians could name diseases, people had turned to the balance of humors, the belief that the body contained four fluids, and illness came when one outweighed the others. The leech, small and simple, was the tool of restoration. Its bite, gentle and precise, was thought to draw away what was excessive, leaving harmony behind. Whether true or not, it was faith as much as science, and faith kept people alive when knowledge could not. And so the leech collector's labor fed more than bodies, it fed belief. She was part of a system older than any book, older even than medicine itself. In her hands, the marsh became a pharmacy, the water a place of quiet exchange between nature and mankind at tea times. She wondered if anyone would remember her when she was gone. The healers' names might be recorded, the nobles who paid them remembered, but her own, the one who supplied the life from which the cure began, would fade like mist at sunrise. Yet that thought did not sadden her. The marsh did not need memory to continue its work, and neither did she. The leeches would return each spring, the water would rise again, and someone else would take her place among the reeds that in the evenings. She sat outside her small hut, her feet bare, the earth cool beneath her. The day's light faded, the sky turning pale gold, then gray, then blue. Fireflies drifted above the water, their glow flickering like lanterns in miniature. The air was full of the soft, constant hum of insects. She watched the reflections tremble on the surface of the marsh and thought of all the lives connected by her quiet labor. The farmers who sold herbs, the healers who prepared remedies, the patients who waited for relief, the leeches that drank, and the blood that returned to the earth. There was a strange peace in knowing that nothing was wasted, that everything fed something else. Her life was hard, but it was part of a balance older than the world of kings and crowns. The marsh gave, the leeches took, and she carried both into the realm of men. Centuries later, her world would vanish. Medicine would change, and the leech would lose its place in the healer's jar. The collectors would disappear from the rivers, their huts reclaimed by moss and silence. Yet, in some ways, her spirit endures. Even now, science still returns to the wisdom of balance, to the belief that healing begins with understanding nature rather than conquering it. If you were to stand by an old pond today, where the air hums softly and the surface ripples beneath your reflection, you might still feel it, that presence, that quiet rhythm of hands and water. You might almost see her there in the mist, her figure bent over the reeds, her basket by her side, her breath mingling with the dawn. The world around her is empty, but her work continues, timeless, steady, unseen. She was not called healer, yet she healed. Not through words, but through endurance. Not through knowledge, but through trust in the earth. And when she finally set down her basket and the marsh reclaimed her footprints, she left behind something that outlasted even medicine. The reminder that care often lives in silence, and that even the smallest lives can carry the weight of healing. The leech collector's lantern may have gone out long ago. Her song faded with the fog, but her work remains written in the water, in the soil, and in the history of every cure that began in patience and ended in life. Among the quieter sounds of the medieval town, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the creak of the mill wheel, the rhythm of spinning wheels, there was another sound, softer but constant. It was the sound of feet pressing rhythmically into wet cloth, the steady squelch of soaked wool being trampled underfoot. It came from the fuller's workshop, a low, smoky building that always smelled of damp fabric and lye. Here, the fuller worked, turning rough, loose woolen cloth into thick, strong fabric fit to clothe a kingdom. Few trades were as physical, as repetitive, and as vital as his. The fuller's task was to take unfinished wool, freshly woven from the looms of spinners and weavers, and make it usable. The cloth that came from the loom was soft, uneven, and full of oil and grease from the fleece. It was fragile, easily torn, and far from the thick, warm material that medieval people depended on for survival. To finish it, the fibers had to be bound together, the grease removed, and the surface tightened. And for that, the fuller was needed. His workshop stood near the edge of the town, often beside a stream or river. The sound of running water mixed with the dull beat of his labor, creating a rhythm that echoed through the nearby streets. Inside, the air was warm and wet. Steam rose from vats of hot water and soap, and the smell, part earth, part wool, part ash, clung to everything. The floor was stone, slick from years of use, and the windows small and dim. The fuller worked mostly by the light of the open door or the dull glow of the hearth. He wore clothes no better than rags, thick and stained, his legs bare to the knees. His feet, hardened by years of work, moved with practiced precision. He stood in a wooden trough filled with cloth and water, his hands on the beams above him for balance, and he began to tread. Step after step, hour after hour, pressing and turning, folding and beating the fabric beneath him. The sound was steady, almost musical, like the slow beating of a drum. The work was brutal. The hot water softened the fibers, while the mixture of lye, made from wood ash or stale urine, cleaned away the oils. The smell was strong enough to sting the eyes, but the fuller paid it no mind. He had grown used to it long ago. His focus was on the rhythm, the endless motion that bound the fibers together. Each press of his foot made the fabric tighter, thicker, stronger. It was not a job that could be rushed. The cloth had to be worked evenly, patiently, until it became what it was meant to be. Outside, the town lived its daylight hours. Merchants shouting, carts rattling, children laughing. Inside the fuller's house, time slowed. There was only the sound of water, footsteps, and the faint hiss of boiling vats. When the cloth was ready, he hauled it out with the help of apprentices, his arms and shoulders straining. The wool was heavy with water, dark and gleaming. They carried it to the rinsing tubs, where clean water waited to wash away the last of the lye. The fabric floated briefly, then sank, turning the water cloudy and gray. Once rinsed, the cloth was hung to dry on wooden frames in the open air. Long sheets of wool fluttered in the breeze like banners, their texture soft but dense. The fuller would stand nearby, hands on hips, watching the fabric move, his eyes reading every fold and crease. He could tell by sight whether it had been worked enough, whether it would hold warmth in the winter, whether it was fit for a lord's cloak or a farmer's coat. He did not need books to know his craft. His knowledge lived in his hands and his muscles, passed down through generations of practice. In the early days, fulling was done entirely by foot, the fuller's own strength serving as his only tool. Later, in larger towns, water-driven fulling mills were built, their great wooden hammers powered by rivers. The pounding replaced the human step, but the rhythm was the same, a steady, endless beating that filled the air for miles. Even then, the fuller remained, tending the machinery, testing the fabric, ensuring that the work never stopped. Whether done by foot or by wheel, the process was always his domain. The fuller's trade was not a glamorous one, but it held quiet dignity. Without him, the weaver's work was unfinished. Every robe, every blanket, every cloak worn through cold nights owed something to his hands. The fine wool garments of nobles and the coarse tunics of peasants alike passed through the same troughs, were pressed by the same feet, soaked in the same mixtures. The fuller was the unseen equalizer of the medieval world. No one dressed without his labor. The townspeople often avoided his workshop, not out of disrespect, but out of caution. The smell, the steam, the damp heat. It was a world apart from the tidy order of markets and squares. Yet those who passed could always tell when he was working. The rhythmic thump and splash carried through the air, day after day, a sound as reliable as the turning of the mill or the tolling of the church bell. It was the heartbeat of industry, the pulse of creation hidden beneath grime and sweat. Sometimes, when he paused for a moment, Leaning on the beam to rest his tired legs, he would listen to the town outside. He could hear the faint hum of conversation, the cry of a child, the bark of a dog. For a moment, he felt part of that larger life, though separated by walls. He knew his work touched every one of them. It gave warmth to their nights, protection to their journeys, comfort to their sleep. Then he would return to his rhythm, step by step, the sound resuming like a slow song with no end. The fuller's trade carried a long tradition. In villages, smaller versions of his craft existed, often done at home. Women fulling cloth by hand or with small wooden hammers, singing softly as they worked. But in towns, the fullers formed guilds, small brotherhoods of workers who protected their secrets and shared their tools. They met by candlelight, their hands rough, their speech simple, but their pride deep. For they knew the value of what they did. They made raw wool into the very fabric of society day and night. When the work was done, the fuller would clean his troughs and hang his tools by the door. The floor would glisten with water, reflecting the last light of the fire. He would sit by the hearth, rubbing his tired legs, the steam slowly fading from the air. The silence felt heavy after a day of sound, but it was welcome. Outside, the wind moved through the drying cloth, making it whisper softly, a final echo of the day's labor. Sometimes, he dreamed of the hills where the wool had come from, the sheep grazing under open skies, their fleece still pure and untouched by hands. He thought of the journey from those green fields to his workshop, from animal to thread, from thread to fabric. Each stage had its own laborer, its own rhythm, its own small piece of creation. His part was just one step in that long chain, but without it, the chain would break. He found peace in that thought. Centuries later, long after his troughs had rotted and his mills fallen silent, the traces of his work remained in the very language of cloth. Words like felt, full, and thickened still carry the echo of his hands. In some old towns, the streets still bear names like Fuller's Lane or Walker's Street, silent memorials to those who once treaded the same ground for hours each day. The mills are gone, but the rhythm, that slow, patient beat, seems to linger in the air, as if time itself remembers the sound of the fuller's feet. Think of him now is to picture not just a man, but a moment in the endless story of human effort, a life lived in movement, in repetition, in quiet mastery. He was part craftsman, part laborer, part musician, his instrument the wet cloth beneath his feet. And though he left no monuments, his work lives on in the warmth of blankets, in the smoothness of fabric, in the comfort that wraps around us without a second thought to eye in the silence of the medieval night. When the fires burned low and the streets grew still, perhaps the only sound that remained was that soft, steady rhythm, water, cloth, and footsteps blending together. A reminder that even in the humblest places, creation never ceased. The fuller's work was never celebrated, but it was never forgotten either. It endured in every woven thing, in every garment that shielded a body from the cold, in every memory of labor that gave shape to survival. And if you close your eyes, you can almost hear him still, the faint, rhythmic tread of feet pressing against soaked wool, the steady whisper of effort that turned raw material into warmth. It is the sound of industry before machines, of patience before speed, of hands and feet shaping the world one step at a time. Long before machines filled workshops and stores sold everything new, there were men who walked the roads carrying the sound of metal in their packs, the soft clink of pans, pots, and tools rubbing together as they moved from village to village. They were called tinkers, and they were the wandering repairers of broken things. The tinker's life was one of endless motion. He did not belong to any one place. His home was the road, his work the quiet art of mending. In a world where every object was precious and nothing was easily replaced, his trade was a lifeline. The people waited for him, the housewives with cracked kettles, the blacksmiths with dull blades, the farmers whose tools had bent or broken under use. When they heard the faint jingle of his pack coming up the lane, they knew help had arrived. He carried little more than what fit on his back or in his handcart: a small anvil, a hammer, clamps, and scraps of tin or copper. His clothes were patched and faded from sun and rain, his boots worn thin from miles of walking. A tinker was not rich, but his craft gave him freedom. He could go where he pleased, sleep beneath trees or in barns, eat from the generosity of strangers, and trade skill for shelter. His work was humble, but to the people he served, it was indispensable. A pot with a hole meant no stew for the family. A broken hinge meant a door that would not close. A dull blade meant more hours of labor in the fields. The tinker restored what life had worn down, and in doing so, he restored a kind of balance. He arrived quietly, never in a rush. In each village, he chose a spot near the well or the square, set down his bundle, and began to unpack his tools. Soon, the sound of his hammer rang through the air, a steady, comforting rhythm that drew attention. People came, carrying their broken wares wrapped in cloth or tucked under their arms. He greeted them with a nod, few words, and began his work. There was something soothing about the way he worked. The repetition of hammer against metal, the smell of smoke from his small brazier, the careful movements of his hands as he patched holes or reshaped edges. He was a craftsman, but also a listener. As he worked, people spoke to him about the weather, the harvest, the small events of their lives. He became a collector of stories, carrying them from one town to the next. The tinker knew many things that no one taught him. He knew how to make a patch hold, how to fuse tin so thinly that the repair was almost invisible. He knew the best ways to melt solder in the wind, how to test metal by sound, how to judge a pot's age by its color. But more than that, he knew the rhythm of the land, when to travel, where to find food, which villages welcomed strangers, and which preferred silence at night. When the work was done, he found a place to rest, a barn offered by a farmer, a corner of an inn's stable, or, more often, the open fields. He lit a small fire, warmed his hands, and cooked what little he had, usually bread and a bit of cheese. The stars above him were the same ones he had followed for years, familiar companions in a life of solitude. The road stretched before him like a promise he never questioned. The people both pitied and admired him. To some, he was a wanderer without home or roots, a man living on the edge of society. To others, he was a symbol of self-reliance, a reminder that skill could replace wealth. He needed no land, no lord, no fixed dwelling. His only loyalty was to his craft. Wherever there was need, he went. Wherever there was work, he stayed, until the next call of the road drew him onward. There was a saying in those times, better a tinker's visit than a new pot. It meant that repair was wiser than replacement. That endurance was worth more than novelty. In that way, the tinker carried not just his tools, but a philosophy, the belief that nothing was truly useless, that even the worn and broken could serve again with care in spring. His path wound through blooming fields, the air sweet with the scent of earth. In summer, he walked dusty roads beneath skies that shimmered with heat. Autumn brought the sound of leaves crunching underfoot, and winter the sharp sting of cold against his face. Each season left its mark on him, shaping his life as surely as his hammer shaped the metal he worked. He was welcomed by many, but trusted by few at first. Strangers in small villages always drew cautious glances, but the tinker's reputation often arrived before he did. Word traveled faster than feet. He fixed our pan last year, someone might say. Still good as new. Slowly, suspicion softened into warmth. Children gathered to watch him work, fascinated by the sparks from his fire. Old women offered him broth. Old men shared ale or stories of their youth. He did not stay long in one place. Once the repairs were done, he packed his tools again, his belongings neatly arranged, his fire carefully doused. He thanked those who had hosted him, sometimes with words, sometimes only with a quiet nod. Then he walked on, the sound of his tools jingling softly with each step, fading into the distance like a small song carried by the wind. Sometimes, his work took him through lonely stretches of countryside, where no houses stood for miles. There, the silence was complete, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath his boots or the cry of a distant bird. He knew the solitude well. It was his constant companion, neither enemy nor friend. In its stillness, he found thought, reflection, peace. He carried memories of every place he had been, every person he had met, each story he had heard. Together, they formed a map that lived not on parchment, but in his mind at towns. His trade connected him to other wanderers, cobblers, peddlers, storytellers, and herbalists. They met by chance at crossroads or market fairs, exchanging bits of news, sharing meals, and then parting again, each returning to the rhythm of their own wandering. There was an unspoken understanding among them, that theirs was a life between worlds, belonging everywhere and nowhere. Though his hands were rough and his clothes plain, the tinker's eyes often held a kind of wisdom. He had seen too many faces, too many places, to judge anything harshly. He knew that every person, like every pot, carried cracks, some visible, some hidden, and that it was not wealth that kept them whole, but care. Perhaps that was why people spoke freely to him. To the tinker, no story was too small, no life too humble. He fixed things, but in some quiet way, he also mended spirits. As the years passed, his pack grew lighter. The towns grew larger, the roads busier. Blacksmiths and merchants began to take over his trade, offering new goods instead of repairs. Some tinkers settled down, opening small workshops near the markets. Others, unwilling to trade freedom for comfort, kept walking, following roads that led farther from the towns and deeper into the countryside. He aged as the world changed. His beard grew gray, his hands slower, but his pace remained steady. He had walked too long to stop now. In the evenings, as he sat by his small fire, he sometimes thought of the first pot he had mended, the one that had taught him patience, precision, and pride. That same patience had carried him through every storm, every long road, every lonely night. There was poetry in his existence, a quiet rhythm of departure and return, of fixing and moving on. He left no monuments, but he left traces everywhere he went. A repaired hinge here, a mended kettle there, a story remembered in a household long after he was gone. People might forget his name, but they remembered his work. Centuries later, the word tinker would fade, replaced by new terms, new trades. Yet the image remains, a man with tools at his belt and a song in his step, walking the road between towns, living by his hands and his honesty. His craft was simple, his life humble, but his legacy deep, a reminder that care, not wealth, sustains the world. That if you listen closely, on a quiet country road at dusk, you might still imagine the faint sound of metal striking metal, a small, steady ring that drifts through the air, fading slowly into the hills. It is the tinker's hammer, echoing through time, a sound that speaks of patience, resilience, and the beauty of making broken things whole again. And so, we've reached the end of this quiet look into the forgotten workers of the early Middle Ages. The people who kept their towns alive when history wasn't watching. They were not nobles, not rulers, and not soldiers. They were ordinary, men and women who simply did what needed to be done. The candle maker who gave light, the fuller who gave warmth, the night watchman who gave safety, the tinker who repaired what others left behind. Each of them played a small but necessary part in the world they lived in. Their names are gone, their tools long vanished, but the results of their work remain in everything that came after, in our cities, our trades, and even in the habits of daily life we take for granted today. History is often written about kings and wars, But it's the quiet labor of people like these that truly built the world. They remind us that progress is rarely loud. It happens slowly, in steady hands, in patience, and in the kind of work that no one notices until it's gone. Thank you for spending your time here tonight. If you enjoyed this calm look into the past, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you can join again for more slow, detailed stories from history. Until next time, rest well and good night.